Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Freeman Spogli Institute Israel Studies Winter Quarter webinar series. My name is Amichai Magen, and I'm the visiting fellow in Israel Studies here at FSI. This winter quarter, Professor Larry Diamond and I are bringing you this new series of FSI webinars exploring various aspects of contemporary Israeli politics, society, and security challenges. This is our third webinar in a six-part series. And you can find recordings of the previous two with Haviv Reti-Gur and with Muhammad Daraushe, respectively, on the FSI website and on YouTube. Israel has a long and painful history responding to hostage crises perpetrated by a wide variety of Palestinian terrorist organizations. Some of the more well-known examples include the 1972 Munich Summer Olympic Games, in which the Palestinian group Black September killed two members of the Israeli Olympic delegation and took 9 Israeli athletes hostage, demanding the release of 236 convicted prisoners in exchange. A botched German rescue operation left all 9 Israeli hostages dead, as well as 5 out of the 8 kidnappers. Only 2 years later, at the northern Israeli town of Ma'alot, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or DFLP, a Palestinian terrorist organization based in Lebanon, crossed the border and took hostage 115 school children at the Nativ Meir Elementary School. Minutes before the deadline set by the DFLP, threatening to execute all the hostages, an Israeli commander force stormed the school. The terrorists opened fire, and the event ended with the murder of 25 hostages, mainly children, 6 more civilians, and the 3 hijackers themselves. 2 years after the Ma'alot massacre in 1976, the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, hijacked an Air France flight from Tel Aviv to Paris and diverted it to Entebbe in Uganda. There, the PFLP separated the Jewish from the non-Jewish passengers, released the non-Jewish passengers except the Air France crew, which they also held, and demanded the release of some 53 convicted Palestinian prisoners, 40 in Israel and 13 in other countries. In this case, Israel conducted a commando raid in Entebbe, rescuing 102 of the 105 hostages and killing all 7 of the PFLP hijackers. In the rescue operation, Yoni Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu's older brother, was killed. We fast forward to 2006, an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, was kidnapped by Hamas in a cross-border attack and held in captivity for 5 years. He was eventually released through a deal in which Israel exchanged 1,027 convicted Palestinian and Israeli Arab prisoners, including Yahya Sinwar, now the leader of Hamas in Gaza and the mastermind of the October 7th attack, which itself involved the kidnapping by Hamas of 253 civilians and soldiers exactly 131 days ago on October 7th. As of today, 112 hostages have been returned alive, 3 by successful IDF hostage extraction operations. 42 hostages were murdered in Gaza or killed by the IDF in friendly fire operations. 11 bodies have been retrieved by the IDF and brought to burial in Israel, and 134 hostages remain in Gaza. As we speak, 100 family members of the hostages are in The Hague filing a lawsuit against Hamas at the International Criminal Court. The charges against Hamas include kidnapping, crimes of sexual violence, and torture. As we speak also, efforts are ongoing in Cairo to reach a deal with Hamas and PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that would include the release of some or all of the hostages in return for an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and the release of a large number of convicted Palestinian terrorists. Those negotiations are currently at an impasse because Israel sees Hamas's demands as excessive. Hamas and PIJ leaders see the remaining hostages as their best bargaining chips and insurance policy for escaping death, and the man ostensibly in charge of the negotiations inside Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, has cut off communication with the Hamas leadership outside Gaza, as well as with Egypt and Qatar 3 weeks ago. And so it is unclear whether Hamas can even implement a hostage release deal. Now, to make sense of the Gaza hostage crisis and its lessons for hostage diplomacy, we are honored to be joined today by Professor Danny Gilbert. Danny is an assistant professor of political science at Northwestern University, and she first came to my attention through an essay she wrote for Good Authority right after the October 7th terrorist attack titled Why the Gaza Hostage Crisis is Different. I then looked her up in Podcastistan and found out that Danny is both extremely thoughtful on these issues and extremely articulate. Danny Gilbert's research explores the causes and consequences of hostage taking, and she has worked on kidnapping by various rebel groups and hostage recovery policy. In 2023, she was selected to serve on the Bipartisan Commission on Hostage Taking and Wrongful Detention at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS, in Washington, D.C. And before embarking on an academic career, Danny served on Capitol Hill for 4 years, including as a senior legislative assistant and appropriations associate, and she was a policy advisor to presidential and congressional campaigns. Danny Gilbert, welcome to this webinar. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Danny. Let's start with some fundamentals. Hostage taking is a phenomena where states or non-state actors, typically terrorist organizations, various rebel groups, kidnap or wrongfully detain individuals for leverage. Can you help us understand the phenomena? How do you conceptualize it? Who engages in hostage taking and why?
Sure. So at its most basic distillation, hostage taking is conditional detention. It's when someone holds a human captive in order to coerce a third party to change their behavior in some way. And hostage taking is as old as the written word. It's written about in the Code of Hammurabi, in the Bible, in the Quran. It was a major feature in the Roman Empire. This is something that has been around for as long as humans have engaged in warfare. And yet the last century has shown a tremendous amount of changes in trends of hostage taking. Specifically over the last 50 years, we have seen a rise at different times of 4 different types of hostage taking violence. First, in the 60s and 70s, the vast majority of hostage taking was hijacking, or what's known as barricade attacks. So in a hijacking, a hostage taker, typically a non-state actor, like a terrorist, a rebel, sometimes criminal actors, would take over an airplane, a train, a vehicle, or a boat, and take the vehicle and everyone inside to a new location. A barricade attack is like an embassy siege or a bank robbery where someone comes in, holds down a building, and tries to hold the hostages inside. That was a major feature of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, so much so that there was an airplane hijacking on average every 5.5 days for about a decade in that period. In the 1980s, hostage taking dramatically changed. Starting largely with groups operating out of Lebanon, there were armed groups, rebels and terrorists around the world, that turned instead to kidnapping. It's a hostage taking in the form of an abduction, taking someone and moving them to a new location, often an unknown location, where they were held for demands of concessions of some sort. And kidnapping has been dramatically on the rise since the 1980s. It has peaked in the last 20 years, with it being a huge feature of the global war on terror, of left-wing movements in South America, in Nigeria, in Mexico, and places all over the world. In the last decade, we've seen a 4th type of hostage taking emerge, or something that I refer to as hostage taking, what I call hostage diplomacy. And some countries refer to it as wrongful detention. That's the official label in the United States. Other countries might think of it as arbitrary detention, which is a category of international law. There's a declaration against arbitrary detention and a working group on arbitrary detention. But effectively, when states once again act as hostage takers, and in this case, they are using their own criminal justice systems to hold hostages under the color and guise of law, arresting foreigners and using them for leverage. So that's been the basic trend. And until October 7th, most people who watch the hostage taking space would have said that kidnapping has largely been on the decline, as hostage diplomacy has become a much larger feature of global hostage taking. And I think October 7th really changed the conversation there.
So we're talking about a phenomena that is very old. As you say, it's mentioned in the Bible, and in fact, in Jewish tradition, there is the concept and the religious duty to release hostages from captivity. It's called Pidyon Shvuim in Hebrew. So this is a very old phenomena. There's been some historical ebbs and flows, but also sort of an evolution in the nature of hostage taking. Danny, could you tell us a little bit about the legal framework that exists in the United States, but also internationally, for trying to limit or at least punish instances of wrongful detention? I do know that hostage taking is a war crime under the laws of war, under international humanitarian law. I believe it's mentioned in the Geneva Conventions as a war crime. But we've also seen, because of this extraordinary wave of plane hijackings in the late 1960s and 1970s, the formulation of the 1979 International Convention against the taking of hostages. Can you tell us a little bit about the mechanisms that exist for dealing with this in law?
Of course. So that's exactly right. Hostage taking is a war crime. It is in the Geneva Conventions. It is an atrocity. And since 1979, it has in fact had its own international convention, the International Convention Against the Taking of Hostages, which formally defines hostage taking essentially as when an actor holds someone else for the implicit or explicit demands of behavior change on the part of a third party. So that could, once again, be a state or a non-state actor that is the subject of those demands. And the 1979 convention came out of this moment where hostage taking was very much on the rise. It brought together countries concerned with a few different things. First of all, establishing definitions, identifying what we are talking about and formalizing that in international law, and laying out the groundwork for who might be able to legally prosecute when these cases emerge. Because so often in hostage taking cases, certainly the ones that capture a lot of international attention, they are transnational in nature. The victim, the hostage themselves, the target, which might be the country or the individuals of whom demands are made, the perpetrator who's actually taking the hostages, and the country where the hostage taking begins or ends or is taking place, those all might be a different set of countries. And the International Convention essentially lays out that any party from those countries might be able to pursue legal action in the case of a hostage taking. So that was largely what the framework was in 1979. The US hostage recovery policy has changed dramatically over the course of hostage taking history as well. Hostage taking actually presented one of the earliest foreign policy crises in the United States, the case of the Barbary Pirates, a very young country when American sailors were taken hostage. And the government made concessions and saw piracy actually increase in the wake of making those concessions. And what viewers and listeners might think about is that the United States supposedly has what is colloquially known as a no concessions policy. Presidents from Nixon to Reagan, most famously, have talked largely about the fact that the US refuses to make concessions to terrorists for fear of both rewarding bad behavior and of incentivizing future attacks. And so that has largely been in the conversation. What I can say is that it actually doesn't accurately reflect what policy looks like for hostage recovery in the United States. So a basic evolution of what that's looked like. One of the major hostage-taking crises of the last century for the United States was the 1979 hostage-taking in the US Embassy in Tehran, where several dozen Americans were held hostage in the embassy for 444 days. This was the end of the Carter presidency. President Carter tried to bring them back, actually launched an entirely unsuccessful rescue mission known as Operation Eagle Claw, which failed to recover the hostages at that time. And the hostages actually were released on the day of President Reagan's inauguration. And in the wake of that failure, the United States reconstituted part of its military. It created Joint Special Operations Command with the idea of having special military units whose primary original focus was thinking about recovering Americans from hostage-taking situations abroad. Fast forward to 2002, when Daniel Pearl, a Wall Street journalist, was kidnapped and brutally beheaded on video in Pakistan. And what came out of the policy change that came out of that utter tragedy was an update to US policy that basically said any American who is kidnapped abroad can be the focus of the US government in terms of hostage recovery. It's not just members of the military or US government personnel, but a priority for the US government to try to bring home any American held captive abroad. The next big change came after the 2013 and 2014 kidnappings of Americans by the Islamic State. ISIS kidnapped and beheaded several Americans. It was a tragedy. It was absolutely brutal. And it also highlighted some of the internal inconsistencies and inefficiencies in the US government with dealing with these cases. And so in 2015, President Obama launched a policy review to look at what the US policies and infrastructure looked like for these cases, that created several new bodies inside the US government to deal with hostage recovery. And so now that includes a decision-making body in the National Security Council, basically at the level of the White House, an operational body that brings together lots of different offices and skills from the interagency to actually work on hostage recovery, as well as a new office and a special presidential envoy at the State Department who deals with hostage recovery at the diplomatic level. And then finally, in the last several years, as a function of this increase of autocratic state hostage taking, the special presidential envoy at the State Department has received more guidance on what kinds of cases that office can handle. There was a bill passed in 2020 called the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act that, on the one hand, gives authority for sanctions against all different kinds of hostage-taking actors, including state actors, and clarifies the kind of international detentions that count toward the US government as being in that category of a wrongful detention, of effectively when the United States government should get involved to try to bring an imprisoned citizen home.
Thanks for clarifying that, Danny. And I know that over the last few years, we've seen a number of high-profile prisoner exchange deals conducted by the United States. I think the two most famous examples are the release of Brittany Griner, the WNBA star who was exchanged for Victor Bout, nicknamed the Merchant of Death, a Russian arms dealer who was convicted for 25 years, I believe, for various terrorism related on various terrorism related charges. And then more recently, in September 2023, the United States reached a deal with Iran to release 5 American citizens, I believe all of them dual nationals. I may be wrong about that, in exchange for the unfreezing of $6 billion in frozen funds. What can we learn from that, and perhaps particularly the Iran deal? And remember, Iran is the chief sponsor of Hamas. You mentioned the 1979 embassy hostage crisis. Iran, in many respects, is the kind of progenitor of modern hostage diplomacy. What can you tell us about the Iranian modus operandi in this regard?
Sure. There are a few different lessons that I think we might take from those deals, and particularly from Iran's actions. So hostage taking, and this is terminology that will probably be familiar to a lot of the viewers, many people would consider hostage taking a weapon of the weak. At the very least, it's an asymmetrical tool of warfare, something that weaker actors can use quite effectively against stronger adversaries. And so that might seem obvious to call it a weapon of the weak if we're talking about a small criminal gang or even a terrorist group. Maybe less obvious when we're talking about states, particularly states with nuclear programs, Russia, China, that engage in this practice as well. Nevertheless, they are very intentionally disrupting the rules and reciprocity of the international system to take foreigners hostage and to go after their stronger democratic adversaries. So hostage taking in various forms has been a tool of the Iranian regime for quite some time. One of the ways that Iranian hostage diplomacy seems to vary from other countries that engage in this practice, like Russia and China, is that Iran seems to use this tool not just for prisoner exchanges, like Russia trading Brittany Griner for Victor Bout, but instead to make it part of much larger geopolitical demands and negotiations. So back in 2015, when the Obama administration worked with European allies and Iran for the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran deal. The Iran deal, of course, was largely about Iran's nuclear program and sanctions, but it also included prisoner swaps. It included the release of Jason Rezaian, who was a a Washington Post reporter who had been the Tehran bureau chief for the Post, and his release from Evin prison, which is where these same prisoners were held who were released in September. And so when Iran is negotiating these deals, they're not just looking for prisoner swaps. They are demanding money. They are demanding relief from sanctions. They are tacking it on to much larger deals in a way that at the moment seems to be almost unique among the state actors here. One other thing that I will say that that's interesting to me, we might see it optimistically when we think about how hostage diplomacy functions, is that negotiations seem to work to bring hostages home. Mm-hmm. They do also reward our adversaries. They reward bad behavior, but the channels are open. And so even countries that don't have diplomatic relations or aren't otherwise speaking or engaged in open hostilities are able to sit down at a table, maybe in a brokered way, to be able to make those exchanges.
You write about the dilemma of making concessions, and I'm just going to quote you and ask for your thinking about this, because I know your position on this question is nuanced and important. So you write that, and I quote, existing research suggests making concessions can incentivize hostage taking. Countries that paid ransoms were more likely to experience a subsequent increase in terrorist kidnapping. But you argue that sometimes making a deal is the right thing to do. So help us understand this calculus, because I think that for most people, the rationale that says, well, you know, if you continue making these concessions to Iran and to others, you shouldn't be surprised, to Russia, you shouldn't be surprised, you know, if this works, we're going to see more and more of this. And actually, just given the set of relationships that Iran has, whether it's with Hezbollah or the Houthis, various Shia militias in Iraq, in Syria, increasingly in Afghanistan, and of course with Hamas and PIJ, we shouldn't be surprised at all that if this is a successful tactic, we're going to see more and more of these types of operations. That also, of course, comes up in the current situation in Israel post-October 7th, because there are those who say, well, you know, Israel kind of set itself up for this mass kidnapping event when it was prepared to pay the price of releasing 1,027 convicted prisoners in exchange for one soldier. So help us understand your thinking about this question of calculus.
There's so much to think about here, and because this audience is probably more academic than some of the spaces where I get to talk about this, I might try to dive into some of those really complicated questions. And I'll start with an invitation to say, we really do need more research on this. I encourage people to think about this question, because policymakers want to make decisions based on really understanding this phenomenon. And the research is, there's not much on this particular question. So the logic of a no concessions policy really relies on the security scholarship concept of deterrence by denial. It's the idea that if perpetrators knew that they would not benefit from holding hostages, then they would be deterred, prevented from taking hostages in the first place. And that's an extremely attractive logic, in addition to the fact that it's unattractive, it's unsavory to reward our worst adversaries for egregious behavior that's a violation of international law, and the fear of making them stronger, the fear of giving Hamas, of giving Iran, of giving other perpetrators resources that they can use to then perpetrate future attacks. So everything about that logic, I think, makes a ton of sense and is quite attractive. Some things that we don't know that lead us to kind of question that logic is what perpetrators truly want from taking individuals hostage. So a no concessions policy is extremely attractive if the only thing that perpetrators are looking for is the concession. But there's a lot of evidence that perpetrators are looking for plenty of things above and beyond the possibility of gaining concessions in a hostage-taking attack. They are looking to embarrass their adversaries. They are looking to recruit and attract recruits and resources from all over the world. This might be a strategy of terrorism known as provocation. There has been a lot of discussion, for example, since October 7th, of the fact that the egregiousness of the attack on the 7th was to invite and welcome kind of an overreaction by the Israeli government, and it works quite well at that. And so if hostage takers want things other than concessions, then simply denying the granting of concessions would probably not be expected to stop it. In the past, there have been countries that have claimed to maintain a no concessions policy. And while the existing research does suggest that countries that pay ransoms quickly often do have more terrorist kidnappings, it doesn't stop them for the countries that refused to pay concessions. And so it never has made this ultimately go away. And so instead, what I have advocated, there's a moral component to it, but also a strategic component to it. The moral side is we shouldn't think about punishing today's hostages and their families when we think about a way to protect the potential not yet existent future hostages of tomorrow. It shouldn't come at their expense to try to find a way to curb this practice. So that's the moral component. And the strategic component is, other than denying concessions, there are likely plenty of other ways to make this practice either impossible or unattractive, costly, consequential for the perpetrators itself. And so for security studies scholars who are listening to this, that essentially means a shift from deterrence by denial to deterrence by punishment. How can the potential targets of kidnapping and other forms of hostage taking make this costly and not just not successful for potential adversaries?
This makes a lot of sense, and I think it really lays out a very exciting and important research and policy agenda of the need to develop a broader tool set and a richer set of ideas and instruments for disincentivizing hostage taking proactively and finding alternative mechanisms that would minimize the number of instances where we have to face that concessions dilemma. I think that makes a lot of sense. And again, for students who are watching this, for people who are looking for PhD thesis ideas, I think Danny's work has been really pioneering in this regard. And as you say, Danny, I mean, there's a really there's a niche here, and there's a lot of room for multidisciplinary research in this regard. I want to veer the conversation specifically to October 7th and the distinctive nature of this mass abduction event that was perpetrated. I want to say by Hamas, but we know that part of one of the features of this mass abduction event is that there's no single actor that has taken all the hostages and that is holding all the hostages. That's part of the kind of unusual feature of this. But there's several unusual features here, which I'd like to think with you about, Danny. So let me enumerate a few of the features that really stand out for me and make this very, very different from the authoritarian state type hostage diplomacy of the type that Russia and Iran and China have pursued over the last decade in particular. So one feature that really stands out is just the sheer number and the different nationalities of the kidnapped, 23 different nationalities. And in a way, this was perhaps a sort of a kidnapping operation that both exceeded Hamas's wildest hopes, and perhaps they lost control over once the border was open and all sorts of people sort of crossed into Israel and kidnapped individuals, some by PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But we also know that some of the people who at least initially were kidnapped by criminal gangs or even private individuals, or what we call, in the Middle East, hamulas, sort of extended families that saw an advantage in not only looting property in Israel, but grabbing Israeli civilians and dragging them into Gaza. So the sheer number is extraordinary. And I think that this created a logistical, but also a public relations burden for Hamas in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, which perhaps helps also to understand why Hamas was willing to make a deal in late November and eventually release 100 hostages, mostly Israelis, but also Thais and also Russian nationals and dual nationals. So that's something that really stands out. Who did the kidnapping? So no one addressed. That's something we've already mentioned. Who was kidnapped? I mean, you write in your research that it is typically men between the ages of 20 and 65 who are kidnapped. Here, we have an entirely different situation. We have just an extraordinary range of people who were kidnapped, including Kfir Bibas, a 9-month-old baby, toddlers, young girls, women, octogenarians, Holocaust survivors. So a much broader range of people who have been kidnapped. Two other things that really sort of stand out for me with this mass abduction operation. One is just the public nature of this, the active recording and broadcasting of the treatment of hostages. You mentioned, Danny, that historically secrecy and taking people to a secret location and sort of denying information about who was kidnapped and where people were taken is a tool that kidnappers used in order to protect themselves. But here we saw something rather different. We saw beatings, we saw sexual assaults, we saw bodies being kicked by sort of cheering mobs as they were dragged into Gaza. So there was almost a kind of a theater, a kind of demonstrative aspect to this act of mass kidnapping, which brings us back to this question of motivation and the fact that perhaps here kidnapping for the use for leverage is not the only motivation. There was a motivation of psychological shock, of humiliation, of violation that is extraordinary. And then lastly, perhaps the type of leverage. So I think you're right that every act of kidnapping and hostage taking really it involves a desire for leverage, whether that's financial leverage or political leverage or some other type. But here we might also introduce the idea of the hostages being used as human shields to protect Hamas and PIJ leaders, but also to be used as bargaining chips for and as insurance policy for possible escape by Hamas leaders if push comes to shove and the pressure by the IDF becomes too great. So there's a lot to unpack there. And I would be really, interested in your thoughts. What lessons are there for you here? And is this really an aberration or some kind of prototype of something that we might see other violent non-state actors engaging in the future?
In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, what really struck me was that there were so many of the worst and most complicated and most devastating aspects of hostage taking kind of all rolled into this one event. So there have been hostage takings before with hundreds of victims, but those events are usually hostage in place scenarios like hijackings or barricade where you know where everyone is. There have been hostage takings that are kidnappings of lots of people, but in that case, it's usually one centralized organization where you know exactly who you are negotiating and bargaining with. Sometimes groups are very explicit about one demand, and that is the demand that in fact they want. And we have seen a whole range of statements and ideas and possibilities from Hamas about all the different kinds of things that can be a goal here, both from the instruction manual for how to take hostages that was found on the bodies of Hamas militants in the weeks after October 7th that shows the strict instructions for everyone who would be carrying out this attack on their goals and what they should do. To the announcement after October 7th that the hostages would be human shields and that Hamas would execute hostages for every unannounced missile strike on Gaza, which thankfully did not come to pass, but might have come to pass. We've seen them used as bargaining chips. One of the things that really stood out to me, and as you mentioned, Amichai, is this notion of who the hostages were, that the vast majority of global hostages are able-bodied adult males. And that is because captivity, even the easiest hostage-taking captivity, is very difficult to survive. It is typically in very difficult environmental conditions. You're not getting the kind of forget, moral and legal respect or anything like that. It's physically quite brutal, and on top of that, can have torture and degradation and starvation and just really very difficult conditions to survive. And so, having so many vulnerable hostages, like children and the elderly, that is. It sounds crass, but that's actually quite a burden on the hostage takers themselves. It's harder for them to keep those kinds of hostages for a long time and to keep them alive. And they're more effective bargaining chips if they are, in fact, alive. And so it did make sense to me that those were the first hostages who were exchanged, that it was the women and children and the elderly who were released in those really promising, beautiful days of November when some of the hostages got to come home, but then demonstrates that Hamas has a much higher price that they have put on the heads of the Israeli soldiers and of the rest of the adults that they continue to hold captive in increasingly degrading and difficult circumstances. And so those are some of the things that stood out to me. Another related to something that you mentioned is this notion of the paradox between holding someone in a clandestine secret space and the ability to garner attention. And so a feature of the hostage takings of the 1970s era is that they were media spectacles. Typically, the first thing that groups demanded was that the press cover their event or publish their manifesto. And often the hostage takers were not negotiating ransoms. They were often negotiating for attention, sometimes for prisoner swaps, and their own safety. They had to effectively negotiate their way out of the situation or die trying. And when groups instead started kidnapping their hostages, they didn't have to worry about that as much. If they could avoid capture, if they could evade having a military raid, then they were able to survive captivity. And the last 20 years of iPhones, of portable internet devices, of all of that technology effectively allowed hostage takers to gain both benefits at once. They could hide somewhere that was more secret and still be able to publicize to the world their brutality and their violence and their message. And I might venture to guess that only because of the internet blackouts, of the difficulty in actually accessing the internet, is probably the reason that we haven't seen more of that in recent months, of hostage takers kind of advertising and using as coercion to the public the hostages that they're still holding.
Yeah, and certainly the testimonies that are being gathered and the evidence that we are beginning to hear of the experience of the people who spent 50 days in captivity in Gaza amplifies the point about maltreatment and starvation and in many cases also sexual violence. Danny, I'm mindful of the time, and I want to turn to Q&A in just a few minutes. But I do want to address one more theme that I think comes up very importantly in your work, and that is the sort of the societal and political ramifications of large-scale hostage-taking events. And in reading what you wrote about American feelings about U.S. Hostage recovery, it really struck me how different the narrative in Israel is, and the discussion, the conversation in Israel is about the hostages and the duty of the state of Israel to recover every last hostage. And let me again just quote something that you wrote, and then to sort of contrast it with the current discussion in Israel. So you write in one of your essays, Americans have strong feelings about U.S. hostage recovery, and those feelings vary dramatically across hostages. In particular, people think some hostages are to blame for putting themselves in danger. Americans are less supportive of government assistance to bring such hostages home. And that really struck me. And I was trying to think why. And I can think of, I think, three main reasons. One is just the fact that Israel is a much smaller society, and everybody knows everybody. And that means that everybody knows either someone who was kidnapped or someone who's related to someone who was kidnapped or murdered on October 7th. So there's sort of one and at most 2 degrees of separation between people. And maybe that makes a big difference. The second thing that really stands out in Israel today is the understanding that the social contract between the state and the population was broken on October 7th, and people were abandoned by the state to sort of fend for themselves. And so the narrative in Israel is that imposes a special responsibility, an added responsibility on Israel to retrieve every last person who has been kidnapped. They cannot be abandoned a second time. Okay, so the first failure really imposes a grand and overwhelming duty upon the state not to leave anybody behind. And then the third aspect, which we've already mentioned, is the notion in Jewish tradition of Pidyon Shvuim, and also what we call in Israel Arvut Hadadit, right? A kind of a mutual solidarity and responsibility for one another. So that, I think, culturally really stands out, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. I also wonder if you have any thoughts or any words of advice for the Israeli government, given the dilemma that it is facing. If you were advising Prime Minister Netanyahu today, or the Israeli war cabinet, what would you tell them? What would be your advice about making a deal or not making a deal with Hamas? And then we'll turn to Q&A.
Sounds great. So the first half of your question, Amichai, is related to ongoing research that I'm doing with Lauren Prather, who is a Stanford alumna and a professor at UCSD, on public opinion about hostage recovery. And it is inspired by some recent cases of hostage recovery in the United States, where there was really vociferous disagreement in the public sphere about the costs to bring different hostages home. And we relate it to a notion that comes out of studies of social welfare, actually, of something called the deservingness heuristic. And the idea of the deservingness heuristic is that people sometimes feel, when they are looking at those in need, that how that person came to need help should condition whether or not the person deserves to receive it. So in its simplest terms, the deservingness heuristic started by saying that if the public thinks that people who are poor because they are unlucky, then the public supports helping out the poor. But if the public instead believes that people who are poor because they are lazy, then the public is less supportive of government expenditures to help those people out. It's a function of individual responsibility and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That is a big notion in American culture. And so we argue that this applies also to notions of hostage recovery. It's a realm in which the government has to make very difficult choices and expend a huge amount of blood and treasure to try to protect its citizens. Even when there is a notion across the government and perhaps in the public that of a notion of leave no one behind, of that is our fellow citizen, and that they should be rescued or recovered out of harm's way, that the public still passes judgment on hostages who they feel walked into danger or used bad judgment, or were somehow complicit in their own capture. And so our research has explored that and essentially how it intersects with cost. So notions of deservingness become more important as the efforts to bring someone home become more costly. One of the things that we're interested in exploring longer term is how that compares from the United States to other countries like Israel, how that compares to other countries that might have a different sense of a social contract or individual responsibility. And we expect that that those patterns will travel, that in countries that have more of an understanding of we're all in it together, we'll see less of a difference across the different hostages in that way. When it comes to advising or thinking about the Israeli government and Prime Minister Netanyahu and the impossible sets of decisions that they have been facing since the 7th of October, it has always struck me since the 8th of October that Prime Minister Netanyahu has expressed two central war aims: destroy Hamas and recover the hostages, and that those two aims are always stated in that order. It's not bring home the hostages and then destroy Hamas, which has been striking to me. Perhaps I'm reading too much into it, but it has struck me that pursuing the war against Hamas has been personally more important to this current government in Israel. And one of the arguments that they have made is that the incursion into Gaza has helped them in the effort to bring home hostages, not even so much in the recoveries. I'm very encouraged by the fact that 3 hostages were recovered in military rescue missions. Rescue missions are exceptionally difficult. They represent the most dangerous time in captivity for the hostages themselves. They are very rarely successful. So even 3 is good news, but it's mostly the fact that the Netanyahu government insists that their pressure on Gaza, the fact that they are pushing and pushing Hamas, has made Hamas feel cornered and makes them feel like they have to come to the negotiating table. And last week,
do you see? I mean, this really goes to the heart of the current public debate in Israel. Are these two war efforts dismantling the military and political control of Hamas in Gaza and maximizing prospects of hostage release? Are these complementary goals, or do they at some point clash? And I think that really goes to the heart of the current debate. Do you have I guess it's more of a it's a devilishly difficult situation because neither you nor I have access to the intelligence that we would need to give a fine-grained answer to that. But what do you make of that rationale? Is it a reasonable rationale to say, well, actually, under these conditions, maximum military pressure is the best bet that we have for retrieving as many of the hostages alive? Or do you see a contradiction there? Yeah.
Yes and yes, in a way. So a military rescue mission achieves both goals simultaneously. It brings the hostages alive, and it typically leaves no combatant survivors. And the best way to bring hostages home is through negotiations. They work to recover hostages, even when they are unpalatable. They frankly work, and so I would love to see, not as a scholar, sure, but as a human being watching this crisis and catastrophe unfold for all of these days. The thing I most want to see is speedy negotiations and the requisite concessions to bring hostages home. And I understand why that pressure has been so grave from the hostage families, especially as people saw that the deal for that wonderful week in November worked to bring people out of captivity. So that's what I continue to hold out for.
Yeah. Okay, let me turn to questions. And I think what I'll do, Danny, I hope you have something to write with, because I think I will just go through the questions that we have and then allow you to make connections between them or to address the themes that arise. And then we will wrap up. A question by Levi Meir Clancy, who writes, I only counted 3 types of hostage taking: hijacking, abduction, diplomatic. But I remember you mentioned a 4th. Could you quickly remind me of the 4th type? Sorry, that's a sort of a more of a clarification question, which, Danny, do you want to address now, and then we'll move to the others?
Sure. The 4th is barricade attacks. So similar to a hijacking in that the hostage taker is with a group of people, but rather than being in a moving vehicle, it's in a stationary building.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Jeffrey Allen asks, according to Human Rights Watch, kidnapping and hostage taking by armed groups in Colombia, especially the FARC splinter groups, continues to be a problem. Child abductions are on the rise in the country. Are there relevant lessons to be drawn from the Israeli experience on October 7th, which can be shared, I guess, and which would be relevant for Colombia? Are there disincentives which might curb the seizure of children? Interesting questions. So that is something for you to think about. Adrian Arima writes, do you consider innocent civilians in Gaza to be hostages? If so, how is their situation different from normal hostages? Okay. Lee Gabbins writes, how do we implement a punish hostage takers strategy rather than a denial of reward strategy? Oscar Rosenblum writes, is there a historical precedent for a self-interested prime minister or leader controlling the negotiations for one side, and how does such a condition impact the conduct of negotiations? So once again, the current hostage crisis in Israel is extraordinary on this dimension as well, given the number of actors who are involved. It's not only Israel and Hamas, and we've already mentioned that Hamas itself is not sort of unified, and there's a disconnect between Hamas leaders inside Gaza and outside Gaza, but also the Qataris are involved, and the Egyptians are involved, and the Americans are involved, and perhaps there are others that we're not aware of. So, but the point that Oscar makes really goes to the political, and the fact that there are those in Israel who find this situation particularly excruciating because they have little confidence in the ability and the willingness, particularly of Prime Minister Netanyahu, to distinguish between his own political calculations, his need to preserve and his desire to preserve the current coalition government on the one hand, and the aims of the war, including in relation to the hostages. So if you have any thoughts about that. Last but not least, Antonia Fore, I hope I'm pronouncing that surname correctly. Professor Gilbert, I have read that there has been an increased number of people being incarcerated by Israel in the West Bank. Can this be seen as a strategic move by Israel? So perhaps you'd want to address those, Danny. Yeah.
What an excellent set of questions. So I've written down my notes. I'll try to go through all of them. So Jeffrey's question about Colombia and the rise of kidnapping there is particularly interesting to me, as I am currently writing a book about kidnapping in Colombia. That is the first large project that I ever conducted in this space. And my book explores why and how armed groups kidnap in Colombia and the short and long-term consequences of that kidnapping. So for anyone on the call who's not very familiar, Colombia was the global hotspot of kidnapping for decades. It was a huge component of a civil war in Colombia in which left-wing rebel groups were fighting against the state. And I've interviewed over 100 former kidnappers and former hostages, as well as security personnel from Colombia, to understand how kidnapping really worked in that way. And so one of the lessons learned from the Colombian case, actually two lessons learned about hostage policy that I think are quite interesting and instructive, are about denial of benefits and about punishing perpetrators. So Colombia, like some other global kidnapping hotspots, has at times implemented a policy of trying to find ways to prevent the targets of kidnapping from paying ransoms. They would lock down assets of anyone who reported a kidnapping to the police. They prohibited the paying of ransom or the purchase of kidnap and ransom insurance, which was in effect to try to pursue this denial, this deterrence by denial strategy. If the FARC and ELN rebel groups were no longer making money from ransoms, maybe they would stop kidnapping. And effectively, all that did was turn the market underground. People wouldn't report to the authorities, and so they wouldn't have the help or support from the state, and they would find any other way that they could to pay. So in the late 90s, Colombia adopted a different approach, which was to think more about punishment strategies. They developed special units in the police and military whose sole focus was to combat and prevent hostage taking in the Colombian context. And they will claim a lot of success in reducing the number of kidnappings. But the most important thing for reducing kidnappings in Colombia was ending hostilities with these armed groups, was pursuing peace processes with the FARC. And so kidnapping was dramatically declining there. The problem now is that there remain lots of armed groups in Colombia, criminal groups, groups affiliated with cartels, many of whom recruit from these former guerrilla movements who have these skills in a country that remains deeply unequal and is suffering from a lot of political problems and economic problems in the country. And so it kind of emphasizes to us that these are largely root cause problems, and that people who don't choose to go into illicit markets because they have other opportunities are not going to pursue that kind of violence. Adrian's question about whether or not I think of innocent civilians in Gaza as hostages. So I think there's some ways in which we shouldn't, and some ways in which maybe we can. So one thing that I will say is that I think that the terminology that we use is very, very important, and that sometimes there's a temptation to use whatever might sound like the harshest possible terminology to call anything terrorism, to call anything genocide or things like that. And sometimes there's violence that's worse than terrorism. Sometimes there's violence that's worse or different than hostage taking. And I would say, even though the hostage taking element of this is where I have my scholarly focus and expertise, that the violence against innocent civilians in Gaza is also completely unacceptable and has been shown in recent months to be a really serious concern for the thousands of Palestinians who have died since October 7th, have been displaced since October 7th, and the consequences of international law. The other thing that I ask myself there, that's probably a little bit more specific, is wondering if the violence from the Israeli side is about coercion, is about attempting to change behavior on behalf of a third party, or if it is about destruction, if it is about removing and displacing, and not just about convincing Hamas to change their behavior. And so those are the questions that I ask myself when I think about terminology. Lee's question about how do we pursue a punishment strategy, that is the million-dollar question, Lee. It's the thing that I think about every day. As Amichai mentioned in the beginning, I'm serving on a bipartisan commission based at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, that our commission is working for the next year or so to try to develop some policy recommendations for either the second Biden administration or whomever is sworn in January 2025, of what we think might make the most sense to recommend in dealing with deterring and preventing and prosecuting different kinds of hostage taking around the world. So one thing that people often look at are sanctions. Sanctions become quite complicated because they are typically only successful a minority of the time. And we're already talking about actors that the United States government sanctions quite heavily. And so thinking more creatively about what might exist in terms of other kinds of policies, of public-private partnerships, things that the private sector can be doing, of prevention strategies. How do we educate travelers and prevent people from going to some dangerous places in the first place? And actually even thinking about incentives and reward strategies. What might governments like the United States and our allies be able to promise to bad actors on the world stage if and when they stop pursuing these wrongful detentions? Oscar's question about the prime minister and thinking about incentives here. So again, this is stepping a bit outside of my area of expertise, but one of the things that scholars of international relations and domestic politics have shown is that leaders have strong incentives to pursue and to continue war fighting when their own electoral prospects and reputation are on the line. And so while this is not my area of study, it's hard for me to watch this conflict and not think that to some extent Prime Minister Netanyahu benefits by the ongoing of hostilities and not bringing this crisis to a close in a way that might not be beneficial to his own domestic electoral prospects. And so I think that that's something that's very much on my mind, and I think on the minds of the Israeli public as they watch the handling.
The counter argument to that, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, is that without a decisive military victory in Gaza, Israel would be, first of all, the social contract internally would not be restored, and secondly, Israel's deterrence vis-a-vis Hezbollah, vis-a-vis all Iranian proxies in the region, but also Israel's set of relationships that it's been cultivating assiduously over the last decades with Egypt, with Jordan, with the Gulf states, the prospect of normalization of relations with Saudi, all of this would be fundamentally undermined in the dog-eat-dog world of the Middle East, where nobody makes peace with the weak. People make peace with the victorious. So that would be the counter argument. But Danny, as you say, I mean, this really goes fundamentally to the heart of the public debate in Israel right now, and we can see how the hostage dimension of this is interwoven with and influences societal and political and party political questions. So it just, again, I think just demonstrates the importance of this subject and its possible manifestations and ramifications, not just within the sort of security and humanitarian realm, but in the political and the strategic. So, yeah, lots to think about there. Any other things you would like to say in relation to the questions that we've already read out? Danny, we have a few more minutes if you would like to take a. Yeah.
Sure. I'll address Antonia's question and then respond to your thoughts more broadly, Amichai, which is the question about increasing our incarceration of Palestinians, if that's a strategic move on the Israeli side. Again, very difficult for me to know sitting here in Chicago from the outside what that intention might be. Having more prisoners to trade demonstrates, is something that they have used in the past. Having all those prisoners that they were able to trade in November allowed them to bring some of those hostages home. Whether that is seen as kind of preparation for a future swap versus simply the Israeli state's perception of an internal security threat is something that it's hard for me to evaluate from here. I think that Amichai, your points are excellent, and I think just really speaks to what an intractable problem this is. And there's a reason that hostage taking has been around for so long, and even as the forms morph and shift, and we might be able to crack down on hijackings by implementing airport security, then it emerges in another way. And so policymakers have been trying to figure this out for a very long time. And it is a problem that is specifically a problem for democracies, for democratic states that care about their publics, that care about their well-being of their citizens, that there is civil liberties concern here, and whether it's a question about we're all in this together, but also intolerance of watching their own citizens be detained, and the free press that allows reporting of that detention makes democratically elected leaders especially vulnerable to this tactic of weaker actors. And so I hope that we can find some immediate solutions in terms of freeing current hostages, but also continue the policy discussion about how to deter this going forward.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you for the questions that we've received. We are out of time. We've certainly not exhausted the subject. And Danny, thank you for informing us and enlightening us. I hope this was also useful for you as you pursue this research agenda. And as you continue to be engaged in these critical policy conversations, I think, as you've said, there is an important and broad research agenda here, which would be of particular interest, I think, to our students. So thank you so much for being with us today. And from the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford, thank you and goodbye.